Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. This is going to be an interesting mini episode. My name is Morgan Lewin. I am one of the moderators, and I write on our subreddit under the username @Quatermain. Joining me today is another one of our moderators, Tyler Alderson. Hello, Tyler.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going fine. Today we're going to be talking about something that comes up actually quite frequently in our subreddit, which is the subject of Black Beethoven. So I'll just hand it over to Tyler now.
Yeah, so the question that we get is a very simple one, and it's interesting because it is popular in the sense that a lot of people ask it. It's not necessarily all that popular in terms of how many upvotes it gets, or it doesn't tend to trend. And in part because, the answer is unlike many historical things, very cut and dried. Question is, was Beethoven black? And the answer is no. Beethoven was not black, and it's very simple. As I said, there's not that much that we can say with absolute certainty in the field of history. But as certain as we can be about really anything, we can be certain that Beethoven was not black. And when I say black, this is something that I go over in the answer. We're talking about somebody who, first of all, our concepts of race are modern, have historical roots, but wouldn't necessarily have been the same as concepts of race during Beethoven's day. So generally speaking, I took it as, would he be considered black today? Was he of sort of broadly African heritage? Did he have dark skin or the kinds of features that we associate with blackness, including things like his hair? That was the general concept that I was sort of exploring this from. And it, again, really doesn't matter which angle you take, because the answer is no. The answer is, no matter kind of what version of blackness you take, he was not that. What's a lot more interesting is why people ask this. And we're going to get to that in a moment. But first of all, just for anybody wondering, the idea that Beethoven's black has been one that's been circulating on social media. It's one of these things every so often some blog posts this, it turns out that Beethoven was actually black, and they post certain evidence. And the evidence is really, really circumstantial at best. And in fact, just to give you an example, people will talk about his hair, which is something that people often associate with blackness, a certain form of hair. And his hair was literally black in color, but it's something that is sometimes thought of. People say, his hair was cut in a Titus haircut, and Titus was some kind of figure, I believe, from Carthage or otherwise an African figure from the time of the Romans, and so therefore it was a Titus haircut. This guy was African, and so therefore Beethoven had sort of black hair in the sense of African hair, and therefore he was African. And this has even been written about as some kind of Afro-like hairstyle. Now, you can imagine this is a pretty big jump. It's said to resemble. A lot of sense. it's said to resemble this person who historically was African, and therefore it was, it's proof that he was African. The truth is that there was a haircut in Beethoven's day that was called the Titus hairstyle. It was sort of a shorter hairstyle that both men and women had. I do not know why it was called the Titus hairstyle, but it is well attested it was European and had nothing to do with any kind of African hairstyle. And in fact, we have pieces of Beethoven's hair, because keeping locks of hair, which I always found extremely creepy, but yes, keeping locks of people's hair and other body parts is a big part of this sort of veneration that people will do. So we do have bits of Beethoven's hair. It's normal, white guy hair, I guess. It's, black hair that's kind of curly. That's to a degree, whenever I see this whole thing about the hair, I remember that when Camille Saint-Saëns was very, very famous, his hair was the big thing, and people would
people were in love with buying his hair. And that was true for many French composers of the mid to late Romantic period. None of them were black, and nobody would have thought that they were black, even though their hair was dark.
Right, exactly. And this is the thing is, that's another thing that comes up a lot is that, they will talk about Beethoven as having certain features, whether it's his nose or even his skin color, he was he was somewhat darker skinned or something like that. And again, you have to remember that this was sort of a European society that was definitely more diverse than we think of. It wasn't entirely lily white. But, if they say he had darker skin, they could have been talking about more along the lines of, say, someone from Spain or someone from Italy, which seems to potentially have been Beethoven's he was somebody who potentially was a little tanner than your average white guy. And that's where he gets kind of some of the notes that people talk about his skin being slightly darker. One of the things that's important is that there were actually a lot of black people around at the time of Beethoven, and people had no problem whatsoever saying that they were black or a mulatto or somehow very obviously racially coded terms about this person. So, for example, today you might say that somebody is tall, dark, and handsome. That just because you're saying they're dark doesn't mean you're saying they're black. You could, I guess, interpret it that way, but really what you're saying is they've got a bit of a tan, and that's another thing that Beethoven, he has sort of some features in some accounts of him that people have taken to be black. Again, it's these kind of stretches to try to fit this idea that Beethoven was, African or black. One of the biggest ones is his ancestry, which people have been trying to mine for some potential form of blackness. And one of the craziest kind of, jumps that I've heard is essentially, it goes like this. Beethoven's ancestors, some of them come from the Netherlands. The Netherlands at one point was under Spanish control. At one point, Spain was controlled by the Moors, who were from Africa. Therefore, I guess everybody in the Netherlands was black, and therefore Beethoven was black. I mean, we're talking about the Moorish incursions into the Iberian Peninsula were in like the Middle Ages.
Yeah, we're talking about nearly 1,000 years.
Yes,
between the Reconquista in 1000 A.D. and Beethoven being born in the late 1700s. Yeah, it's
right.
Crazy.
This is just this massive stretch, and that's the thing. We have some accounts of his ancestors. They are described, actually his grandfather is described as having ruddy cheeks, which is something you normally associate with kind of a pale white person. These kind of red ruddy cheeks. Nowhere is it at all suggested that they might be in any way of African or Moorish or however you want to say it, descent. There's some question. Sometimes people bring up, well, did his mother have an affair with a Moorish sailor or, some sort of visitor, which of course we don't, like, nobody who hasn't taken a paternity test knows for 100% certain that they are not, their father's child. But we also just can't assume that everybody is not their father's child. And it's worth noting, caused a little bit of suspicion, as happens in any kind of case where a child is born that does not look anything like the father. This is something that is, and there is absolutely zero suspicion along those lines. So again, we can't say for certain, but the fact that the general idea of Beethoven being black is linked to these very disparate, very kind of long shot, small possibility concepts we can be almost 100% certain that he wasn't. And we have portraits of him, and we have, accounts of him, and none of them suggest this. So again, that's where we're standing in terms of the actual question. And you can read the answer I wrote for a little bit more in-depth, debunking of some of these popular concepts.
Yeah, we're definitely going to link that in whenever we post this episode.
Right. But then the question becomes, well, why are people so invested? Why does it matter to so many people that they'll go through these long links, that they'll take something that happened in 1,000 years before Beethoven was born and somehow try to sort of wrench that over 1,000 years ahead to try to justify some kind of seemingly wild concept to claim Beethoven as black. And also, on the other hand, why does the idea of Beethoven being black, because again, as I said, it's a question that is often asked on our subreddit and elsewhere, and it's often very quickly derided, and people immediately go in and say, absolutely not. Why is the idea of Beethoven being black so is such a big problem for some people? Now, again, he wasn't. He was not black. But if he was black, why does that matter? And the answer is that Beethoven is at the kind of the top of this pyramid of music that Western society and white society has created. And classical music sits as the prestigious music, the be-all and end-all, the greatest music that anyone could ever make, in this concept that has been quite dominant for the past couple hundred years. And Beethoven happens to sit right at the top alongside Bach and Mozart and a handful of composers. He is really at the top of this particular pyramid, and you can point to things like his Fifth Symphony, which is the very famous da 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 da, or the Ninth Symphony with its just explosion, its beautiful choral explosion in the final movement. Da 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 da. Those are two of the most famous pieces in all of classical music, two of the most beloved and prestigious pieces in all of classical music. That is now, if you say classical music is the greatest music, Beethoven was the greatest classical composer, it makes a lot of sense why
Certainly.
People would want to make Beethoven black, because historically, not only have people of color been, shut out of a lot of white institutions like classical music, their own music, the music that people of color have made, which is plentiful and really, really good, and extremely varied, has been set below on that pyramid. So classical music is at the top, and then you've got, this other stuff, and people, oh yeah, this is great, but it's not Beethoven. And that is really the issue, is that Beethoven sits atop on this pedestal, and people want to essentially claim some of that prestige for themselves, for people like them. And it's a perfectly understandable impulse. It is the same impulse that has led to white people and Western society putting Beethoven on that pedestal in the first place, and claiming him as the greatest. So that's why it's popular. And one of the things that I end the answer with is trying to reframe it, because we can point to various people who were black who were in classical music, even some friends of Beethoven's. He had a violinist friend named George Bridgetower, who was a phenomenal, by all accounts, violinist. Beethoven actually wrote music for him. And he was black. Or you could point to Joseph Bologne, who was a very well-known composer in his day. He was also a fencer and a military leader and an abolitionist. The dude was like one of the coolest people in history. You can point to that, but you're still putting classical music on that pedestal. You're still bringing classical music into this realm as, well, it's the greatest music of all time, and trying to shoehorn people of color into that. And that's really ultimately the issue, is that we have made classical music into this untouchable music that is just ultimately better than all other music, which just isn't true.
Certainly not. Yeah, I think that this is an issue that we have discussed about privately in the past. This is something we've also talked about in a previous podcast episode that we recorded together, in which I talked about Latin American art music or classical music or whatever you want to call it. And it's always the same thing. I want to go back to something that you mentioned a little bit earlier. This particular concept of having both people who reject this idea of Beethoven being black immediately, and it's like a knee-jerk reaction. It's amazing to see. And people who are trying to push this idea forward, they're both after the same thing. They're both trying to win the same argument, this idea that Beethoven being either white or black is going to continue or is going to start bringing a certain amount of prominence to a specific group of people. And that's just complicated on a multitude of levels that goes way beyond the musicological sphere or the historical sphere even. But I believe personally that it ends up coming to something that is very close to my heart when it has to do with the way in which our cultures frame the way in which we perceive our way going forward as collective groups of people. So, for example, as someone who nobody would have any issue calling brown, because, well, I am brown, I was laughing earlier at the repetition of, okay, Beethoven wasn't black, because we have to repeat it all the time. But this idea that, for example, if we were to see a description of Beethoven as someone tall and dark, like you said, dark is never something that people are going to use to refer to either brown people or black people, because we are referred as black or brown. That's just the way it is. There's no much of a difference. So when you analyze this entire concept of classical music, art music, as this monumental monolith that is unchangeable, that is just echoes of a beautiful, magnificent, romanticized past, you start to forget the fact that classical music, for example, continues to exist because people of all walks of life, of all ethnicities, continue to play it and record it, for example, and even arrange it. There's something that many people I've encountered in my lectures. They're very surprised whenever I tell them that many times when you see a recording and when you compare a recording by a different orchestra and a different conductor, you will notice certain differences because the arrangements are different. Most of the time, we don't actually listen to exactly the same thing that was written by the composer hundreds of years ago. Because, well, scores and sheet music are arranged over time. They change, they shift. Conductors give them their own interpretations. Musicians interpret different pieces in different ways. So what I'm trying to get with all of this is that if someone were to tell me, for example, that, I don't know, that Joaquin Rodrigo or Manuel de Falla were brown because they were from Spain, I would probably laugh very hard on their faces because Spanish people are not brown. I am brown. I am from a former Spanish colony. I am brown because not because I'm Hispanic. I'm brown because my ancestors were natives. And there's some Spanish mixed in there, but mostly native people. So there's this very profoundly and deeply rooted concept about Eurocentric culture that forces us in general to try and copy the way in which we perform our own identitarian cultures. When we recorded that episode I was mentioning about Latin American classical music, I was mentioning that at the very beginning in composition in Latin America, we saw composers trying to copy European styles. That was the reasonable thing to do. You weren't going to invent something. No, you wanted to be as close and as similar to European music as humanly possible. That is very much the case for North American classical music as well. It's not something that is only pervasive to Latin American classical music in the 19th century or the early 20th century, for example.
Absolutely. And it's something that actually another answer that I wrote on recently on the subreddit touches on this. The Soviet Union, when they were sort of trying to deal with and that's a word that's had many connotations, deal with the many ethnic minorities that lived within their boundaries, which was huge. Yes. One of the ways in which they decided that they were going to sort of integrate that culture into this grand concept of Soviet identity was to essentially create classical music that incorporated the themes of the folk music of a particular place. So, for example, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, so on and so forth, but was still very much classical music. They'd create these, folk operas and folk symphonies. And one of the ways in which they presented this was essentially a lifting up of, the local folk traditions. Now, we're talking about traditions that are, long-standing, centuries, if not thousands of years old, that have many different customs and are, in many ways just as complex and interesting as Western classical music, but they didn't see them that way, in part because they were not Western. And so this idea that classical music, that turning them into classical music was in some way uplifting them and in some way sort of raising them into a better, more artful music, is something that is pervasive. It's true in the United States. You get a lot of folk music that gets adapted into classical music. I like a lot of, say, Copland, who did a lot of that. I like a lot of his arrangements, but a lot of the discussion around it as well, he took these, fiddle tunes and turned them into art. And in fact, I remember listening to Leonard Bernstein essentially saying that Copland sort of transformed these folk tunes into art. And you sit there thinking, well, were they not art in the first place? Were they not worthwhile in the first place? And that's where you come back to with Beethoven, again, sitting at the top of this pyramid where he is viewed in so many ways as the very pinnacle of musical achievement. And you can either try to claim him somehow as your own, and it's certainly something that Western civilization does all the time. And you can look at the former president of the United States in one of his speeches said, something along the lines of, "We wrote the symphonies." Now I don't know who we are, because we're Americans, and Beethoven was German, so he was somehow trying to claim, I guess, Western society or white people is really the subtext of that.
Of course.
But that's the point, is that this was our guy, and he wrote the symphonies.
This is us. This is who we are.
And that is why that question has become so popular and so pervasive. And unfortunately, people who are trying, as you say, to sort of claim Beethoven as one of them, either mostly is black. I have yet to see something claiming him as like Asian or, somehow like, Native American or something. Although I'm sure someone could.
Give me time. Give me time.
Sure.
I
could figure out.
I've already submitted my abstract for this year's conference, but for next year, you're gonna hear all about how Beethoven was one of my ancestors.
Yeah. He's. I anxiously await that. But unfortunately, the people who are doing that are essentially still falling prey to using a very white-centric lens, which is that they're still giving all of the credit in the world to the classical music establishment, and not recognizing that there's actually a ton of music and a ton of historical figures out there who did incredible things and made incredible music, and it just wasn't classical music. It just wasn't Western classical music. And I should say, we've gone this long in this podcast. I am, by profession, a classical music radio host, and I have degrees in music. I love classical music. I listen to classical music. Once the symphony orchestra near me has started up concerts again, I will be going to those concerts. You similarly, I think we can. I'm not speaking out of turn by saying you are somebody who loves classical music. We are not trying to take down classical music or say that it's bad.
Of course not.
Or say that
it feeds us.
Right. But I also like a lot of other music. I like, traditional Irish music and, bluegrass and American gospel music. There is nothing necessarily inherent, or especially, I hate this term, universal, about, say, a Beethoven symphony, as opposed to that, that makes it better, or, that is somehow in opposition to Mahalia Jackson, singing Joshua at the Battle of Jericho, or, that makes it inherently better than Amalia Rodriguez singing Fado. There's nothing. You can argue, people talk about, it's, complexity or, some kind of human condition. And you get all these studies that show that if you show your baby classical music, then he'll become a genius or something like that. Essentially, classical music is one of many, many forms of music. It's a beautiful music. It's a wonderful music. And it is something that I cherish. But its prestige in society is entirely due to social reasons, not some kind of inherent musical reason. That it is somehow, it just so happens that like white people in, Germany and France and Italy just so happened to come across this particularly universal or incredible form of music. That's just not true. It's a social construct like so many other things. But it's a wonderful social construct, not without its problems, but a wonderful one. Exactly.
Yes.
And so I would highly recommend that anybody listening to this go back and listen to the podcast that we did. I believe it was back in September or October, and we can probably get a link up there. I would highly recommend that people go out, and I'll just throw a bunch of names at you, and listen to Joseph Boulogne and Florence Price and William Grant Still and R. Nathaniel Dett, all of whom are actually black classical composers. I highly recommend that you champion and seek out black performers and people of color and composers in classical music. But again, we cannot simply focus on classical music and say that it is the be-all, end-all, because ultimately there are people all over the world of all different ethnicities and races and backgrounds who are making incredible music of extremely varied genres, and a lot of it is really wonderful, and you've just got to kind of find what you like, but don't make the mistake of thinking that Beethoven is somehow this universally singular genius, because he wasn't. I would even potentially say he's a genius. It's a fraught term, but he was certainly an incredible person who made really remarkable music. But he was one of many people who did that.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that Beethoven was certainly and undeniably extremely talented person. That is for sure. So I just want to agree with what you were saying. None of what we've said so far is meant to disparage classical music as an art form at all. I'm just like you. I am a very eclectic person in my music tastes. My family is always laughing at me because whenever I put my playlists on shuffle, I can jump from Beethoven to Taylor Swift to Bolivian folk immediately without any kind of and it makes very little sense. But classical music is certainly, it has a very special place in my heart for a multitude of reasons. It is what I dedicate most of my research and my time to. Well, romantic music, but again, it's still classical. Let's call it classical. But it's not the best music. I think that it comes down to that. You cannot decide that there is a specific genre or a specific style of music that is the best in the entire world. I don't think that you can even do that for regions or for countries or for even cities. That kind of ranking, that kind of extreme valuation of music and of any kind of art really is dangerous. It's dangerous because it sets a precedent that has to do with something that goes beyond art. It's about prestige, it's about privilege, and it's about mainly being them versus us. And that is always problematic. That is always dangerous.
Yes. And it's also something worth noting that if you look at concert programs during Beethoven's time, and this is a whole other massive discussion, but I'll briefly get into it right now. If you look at concert programs during Beethoven's time, you can actually compare them to a lot of concert programs now. The only difference is that at the time, Beethoven's music was brand new. You might be presenting his one of his works with a Haydn symphony. That was only probably 20 or 30 years old at the time. I mean, Haydn was just a few decades older than Beethoven was. Now, they are, over 200 years old. And the reason for that is that during the Romantic era, during the kind of mid-1800s, and certainly once we get into the 20th century, there has been this, the uncharitable way might be calling it a fossilization, but it's really kind of a canonization of classical music that from the kind of mid-19th century on, there's a lot of looking back, and there's a lot of actually viewing classical music as something that is historical rather than present. And that's why today, when you look at, say, a symphony orchestra program, you are actually much more likely to see something written in, say, 1780 or 1820 as you are something written in 2020. Whereas in Beethoven's day, you actually saw a lot of new music, newly composed music, or at least music composed within the past couple decades at the absolute most. Yeah. This canonization comes into effect again, sort of because of thoughts in the 19th century. It again becomes kind of really, again, fossilized is the word I keep coming back to. It's kind of uncharitable, but in some ways it fits. To the point where now there's a very clear cut sense of Bach and Beethoven and Mozart, and these are the top composers of classical music. All, by the way, Germanic, German-speaking composers, which is another thing that it does. It really centers German music, and everything else, say French music or Italian music or Russian music, is in many ways defined by its relationship to German music. In the ways that we talk about, this sounds French. Well, why does it sound French? Well, because it doesn't sound German in this way, essentially. Creates that canon is one of the ways in which we create this prestige, and in which we can then signal to other people, because now we have said, this is the classical music canon. Beethoven is the greatest composer, and Mozart is the greatest composer, and so on and so forth. It becomes a way of social signaling where actually people who want to show that they are of an upper class, or people that want to show that they are educated, and obviously the subtext to a lot of this is people who want to sort of show their whiteness, can show that by being informed about classical music and knowing Beethoven, knowing Mozart, knowing Bach, and engaging with that specific canon. It's a lot easier to do that than it is, to have this massively broad genre of classical music and be sort of picking here and there. I like Rodrigo. I like Tchaikovsky. I like Balakirev. That's a lot harder to sort of compare notes on. When you say Beethoven, he's the big one. Mozart, he's the big one. If you want to know anything about anything, you've got to know about these guys. It creates a sort of a barrier to a certain kind of cultural identity and prestige. Again, that is a 5-minute wrapping up of what could be an hour and a half talk on the meaning of the classical music canon and the creation of the classical music canon. But it is, again, another reason why Beethoven specifically occupies this space where he is very attractive for people who want to claim some of that prestige for themselves and for people like them, to try to jump on these extremely thin and very speculative reasons as to why Beethoven may or may not have been black.
Well, yes, we could definitely go on forever. Actually, we might actually do a mini episode farther down the line about specifically talking about the canonization of classical music in general. But then this has been great. We are going to have to wrap this up because we are over the mark. But then again, we do history. We love to go over the limits. Thank you so much for joining me today, Tyler. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thank you. And again, highly recommend people go back and listen to the podcast episode that you gave some really wonderful Latin American examples of classical music composers. It was really great for me to hear, and I've incorporated a lot of those composers into my listening. So I would highly recommend that.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I'm glad you've incorporated them because they are wonderful composers, all of them. Although many of them are also white. I should mention. But yeah, thank you so much, and well, we'll be seeing all of you next time.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.